In today's video, I want to compare Ubuntu to one of its flavors, Ubuntu Budgie. Let's start with the obvious, which is that they are very similar. First and foremost, these two distros are Ubuntu, so they are almost identical in almost every aspect, except for the desktop environment. So as you might know, Budgie was originally developed for Solus OS, and Ubuntu Budgie is the distro that uses the Budgie desktop environment on top of Ubuntu. Budgie uses some known technologies, such as GTK, but it does have its own look and feel, and it definitely has its idiosyncrasies. Before comparing the two desktop environments themselves, I want to say something about their lifespans. For some reason, the long-term support version of Ubuntu Budgie is not supported for as long as its Ubuntu counterpart. I don't know why, but if you take a look at the Ubuntu Budgie download page, you can see that the LTS version, which is 20.04, will only be supported until April of 2023, whereas Ubuntu 20.04 will be supported until April of 2025. I'm not saying that it's a deal breaker, but it is something you might want to take into consideration. For this comparison, I'll be using version 21.04 for both Ubuntu and Ubuntu Budgie. 21.04 is a short-term support release, but it is the most recent one as of now. I have both of the distros on virtual machines, and as you can see, I allocated two processors and the same amount of RAM for each. Let's start them and see which one loads faster. The virtual disks for both of them are on an external drive, so they will be somewhat slow to load. But I don't really care about the absolute load time, it's more about the difference between them, if any exists. And we can see that it took them about the same time to load. With that out of the way, let's dive in. The first thing I want to talk about is something that only pertains to physical machines and not virtual ones. But if you install Ubuntu Budgie on a laptop with a touchpad, tapping the right side of the touchpad will be considered a left click. To achieve the right click effect, you need to tap the touchpad with two fingers at the same time. In Ubuntu, on the other hand, if you tap the right side of the touchpad, it's considered, surprise surprise, a right click. It can be tweaked, but that's the default behavior. From what I figured out, this two fingers tap for right click is the way it's done on Mac. And the resemblance between Budgie and Mac doesn't stop here. I think that it's quite safe to say that the Budgie desktop was heavily inspired by the Mac's look and feel. Ubuntu Budgie uses Nemo as its file manager, whereas Ubuntu uses the more widespread GNOME files, aka Nautilus. Nemo and Nautilus bear a lot of resemblance, which shouldn't come as a surprise, given that Nemo started as a fork of Nautilus about a decade ago. I would like to mention a few differences though. First, the sidebar. It can be hidden in both by F9, and it can of course be shown by pressing F9 again. But in Nemo, you also have an icon you can click on, which you don't have in GNOME files. Both support grid and list views. Another difference is tree view. In Nemo, you have a classical tree view. In GNOME files, tree view is not available, and the closest thing you have is expanding folders. And once you enable it, you get this little arrow next to each folder, which you can use to see its contents. If you right-click on some empty space, in Budgie you get the option to create a new file. That's something you don't have in Ubuntu. That's because, by default, the templates folder in Budgie comes with a bunch of useful options, and in Ubuntu it comes empty. You can, of course, add any file you want to this folder, but that's what you have by default. In Nemo, you can type in the path to a folder that you want to open. Which is something you cannot do in GNOME files. As for opening the file manager as root, Nemo seems to support it better. You can do it in both. But while Nemo is well aware that it's running as root and even warns us about it, and everything seems to work as usual, GNOME Files seems to struggle. Moreover, in Nemo you can even right-click on any folder and open it as root. Which is something you don't have in GNOME Files. As for quick access to specific folders, both support it. So if I have a folder that I want to be able to quickly access, I can drag it and it will be added. But while in Ubuntu, I have to place it in the bookmarks section, below all of the default shortcuts. In Budgie, I can place it anywhere I want. It's only a matter of order, but for shortcuts, it might make a difference for you. You can connect to a device on your network, for example a Samba server, from both distros. To do it with GNOME Files, you open Other Locations, and in the bottom we can type in the address of the server. We also have a nice little legend to remind us of the format for popular protocols. So I can connect to my local Samba server. And right away I can see the contents. Once I connect, I also get a shortcut to it, as if it was an external disk. To connect to the same server in Ubuntu Budgie, I just type in its address in the address line. And once I do it, I get a new entry under Network. A useful feature that both of the distros have is searching a file by its name. But it's done a bit differently. So, for example, I have an image file whose name is Dragon, but I don't remember the path to it. To look for it in Ubuntu Budgie, I can use a tool called Catfish. I can also use it to search inside the folder. And right away, the file is found with its exact path. To do the same thing in Ubuntu, I just open the folder in which I want to look for the file. Then I just start typing the name of the file. And right away it's found, and I can see the path relative to the folder in which I searched. When trying to run an sh script in Ubuntu Budgie, you get this menu in which you can choose if you want to run the script or edit it in a text editor. But when you do the same thing in Ubuntu, it just opens the file in a text editor. You can of course change this behavior in Ubuntu, such that an option to run the script will be displayed, but that's what you get by default. The Ubuntu desktop comes pretty much bare bones in terms of desktop widgets. It hardly has any. On the right, you get quick access to volume control, some basic network configuration, battery status, and that's about it. On the top, you have a quick view of the calendar and notifications. The desktop in Ubuntu Budgie is more feature-rich. By clicking on the arrow, the side menu opens, and it can display notifications and applets. By default, there are 3 applets: calendar, music player, which also has volume control and is integrated with the default music player, and input audio devices. This sidebar is pretty nifty because it responds to what's currently running. So if, for example, I have YouTube running, as well as the music player, they'll be automatically added to the sidebar, and I'll be able to control them from it. You then have a separate volume control, a battery status monitor that can also show percents, next to it we have the notifications view that actually opens the very same sidebar we opened with the arrow, but it opens it with the notifications tab instead of the applets tab. We have a basic network controller, and then we have the Places widget, which is integrated with Nemo and lets us quickly access the Nemo shortcuts, including the ones we defined ourselves. We then have a quick note applet, which lets us write some text. And this quick note is quite unique. You don't see something like that too often. And the text there will always be one click away, whatever you're currently doing with the operating system. And finally, we have the Workspace Overview applet, which leads me right to the next point. The idea behind workspaces is to reduce clutter during your workflow. So if I have several applications running, and then I want another one, but it's not really an integral part of what I'm currently working on, I can open it in a different workspace. So let's say that I'm working on a project and I need the web browser, the file manager, and the text editor for it. And then I want to hear some music while I'm working. So I can go ahead and open my music player, but it makes sense to open it in a different workspace. To do that in Ubuntu, I use the combo Ctrl, Alt, down arrow. And it opens a new workspace that looks like it's not running anything. Here, I can open my music player. And to get back to the first workspace, I can use either Ctrl, Alt, up arrow, or the Start button, then pick the workspace I want. Now, the music player is open and can play music. But if I use Alt-Tab, it won't be among the options, which allows for more convenient and more fluent workflow. To achieve the same thing in Ubuntu Budgie, we first need to create the new workspace. This can be done with the Workspace applet. And then to switch to the new workspace, we use the combo Ctrl, Alt, right arrow. And if we open the music player in this new workspace, and then I use Alt-Tab, I will only see the music player. And if we take a look at the Workspace applet now, we can see the applications that are open in the first workspace and the ones that are open in the second one. By the way, in the Ubuntu Budgie settings, it says that the shortcut to switch workspace is super page up and super page down. But it's a mistake, it simply doesn't work, and the correct one is Ctrl, Alt, right arrow. Ubuntu supports basic window placing. I can, for example, drag an application to the left edge of the screen, and it will be resized to occupy the left half of the screen. I can then do it with another application to the right, and they will be placed side by side. I can do the same thing with the keyboard shortcut, super, and an arrow key. Ubuntu Budgie supports all that, but it can do more. I can ask Ubuntu Budgie to auto-tile, and up to 4 applications will be placed at the 4 corners of the screen. To do that, we first need to enable the window shuffler. And then I can use the keyboard shortcut Super A. And if I then decide to move one of these windows to another corner, I can choose it, then move it around with Ctrl, Alt, and any of the numbers. By default, the Ubuntu application panel is on the left, and even though you can move it around, it's always there. You could claim that it's a waste of precious desktop real estate. Ubuntu Budgie has its application panel on the bottom, with its icons getting bigger whenever you hover over them. Whenever an application uses the area used by the panel, it will auto-hide. But if you then hover around its area, it will pop up again. By the way, the order of the applications in the Ubuntu panel generates keyboard shortcuts. For example, Thunderbird is the second application on my panel, so I can press Super 2 and Thunderbird will open. Something that the Ubuntu panel cannot do is minimizing an open application. So if an application is open, you cannot click on the panel to minimize it. Which is, in my opinion, a useful feature that I would like to see. You can do it on Budgie. When you have multiple instances of the same application, you can use the Ubuntu panel to see all of them. On Budgie, you have to right-click on the panel. And you only get the names of the windows, no screenshots. Ubuntu comes with GNOME Terminal as its default terminal emulator, whereas Ubuntu Budgie comes with Tilix. Both of them are great tools. Their appearance can be customized, and they do everything you would expect from a terminal emulator. Tilix has one extra feature though, which is split screen. So I can do something like this, and then I can also split vertically. The GNOME terminal doesn't have an equivalent feature. They both support multiple tabs though, and you can always create a new tab with Ctrl-Shift-T. It looks like Ubuntu is supposed to look like Ubuntu. There are some configurations at your disposal when it comes to appearance, but they are very limited, and out the box you can only change the color scheme and a few options for the left panel. Ubuntu Budgie, on the other hand, really goes above and beyond when it comes to themes. There are quite a few available themes, and every one of them is unique. There is even one called White Sir. And I leave it to you to guess what it's designed after. You can also change the desktop layout. And one of the options here is, surprise surprise, Cupertino. So, which one is better? First and foremost, it's a matter of taste. In my opinion, Ubuntu Budgie is more feature-rich. Out of the box, it just gives you more, well, everything. But somehow, for me, it didn't really translate to the day-to-day usage. I have used Ubuntu Budgie as my main desktop for about 3 months now, and I had used Ubuntu for much more than that. Ubuntu is more limiting, but in my opinion, it's for a reason. When you're using, say, Windows, you know that it's Windows. Sure, you can change a few things here and there, but if someone is looking over your shoulder, they will have no doubt that you are using Windows. And the same goes for macOS. They are both popular brands, and people tend to trust them just because of how popular they are. I think that that's what Canonical is trying to do with Ubuntu. They don't always choose the most flashy program, even when it's open source, and they want your desktop to look like Ubuntu. What they achieve by that is making their stuff look more familiar. Over the years, more and more people get acquainted with the brand. And whatever it is that Ubuntu claims to do, it does well. Ubuntu Budgie is really rich and just looks good all around. But somehow, in my experience, it's not as easy to work with. And it's more buggy as well. Nothing major, just small stuff that isn't optimized. What do you think? Which one do you like better? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.